Title of my presentation is Botswana, the Jewel of African Transformation. And when you think of transformation, you really want to think about how you can go from, say, for example, a country that was formerly a protectorate of the UK and who is now independent and has progressed marvelous with respect to their development, not only their economic development, their social development, despite a number of different types of things that have taken place. So if we look at the economy, if we look at the location of Botswana, as you indicated, it's located in Southern Africa, right above South Africa, between Namibia and Zimbabwe, with Zambia on the north and very close to Zimbabwe. And so it's a landlocked country. And it's received its independence in 1967. And at that time, it was considered one of the poorest countries in the world because they had not developed their resource base. But in I believe it was 67, 68, they discovered a very large diamond pipe. And this is what helped them make the transformation. They basically had a resource base that was highly valued, which allowed them to use their returns on their sales of the diamonds, in which they are a major producer of, and to fund the development of their economy. So if we look at the growth rate of the Botswana's gross domestic product, what we actually see is a very increasing rate of economic development with respect to the gross domestic product. So it's increasing at an increasing rate. And we notice that I put American recessions on the background of the growth development. So you can see some areas where there's a critical factors which have affected the economy. And we have the international financial crisis, which basically was a small dip, what we might call a structural break. And then we have the countrywide financial crisis after the financial crisis. And now we're in the pandemic, which basically we're up in this year around 2020. But Botswana has been subject to drought for a very long time. And so one of the problems with the economy is that they're a drought-prone economy, but they're always in a position to basically address the economic and financial or crises that the country has entered into. So if we look at Botswana basically is linked very much with the South African economy. And so if you look at the growth rates of both the Botswana economy and the South African economy in terms of their GDP, you see a very similar trend line, which is very much the same. Prior to and the early parts of independence, Botswana was associated with the economy of South Africa and a number of imports into the country. And so over the years, what has happened is that Botswana has now become more independent. And we'll see when we look at the structure of the economy with respect to the different sectors.
Okay, Dr. Andrews, just one quick question before we move on. With this, you mentioned an interesting point that the slide illustrates that Botswana and South Africa's economy is pretty much the same in terms of their growth rates, and that for a long time, Botswana depended on South Africa for trade. Could you talk a little bit just about what the relationship, the international trade relationship is like between Botswana and the United States?
Well, basically, there were a great deal of services that were not available in Botswana during the earlier periods of their independence. So for example, medical care, they would go into South Africa. And basically right across the border is a part of South Africa, which is associated with the Botswana people in Botswana. And so therefore there's relationships and family relationships and customs and institutional arrangements that they share on both sides of the border. And so therefore, a great deal of services were incorporated in their imports and also in terms of their products that they were using. So that was the link that was really taking place between the two countries. Now, what has happened is that as Botswana has grown, what we'll see is we see a delinking of a number of those items, areas of imports, and Botswana building up its economy to foster the growth and development of those services that they now have as domestic products.
Okay, and then just one last question regarding this slide, because this is very important with the opportunities which you'll continue to talk about with Botswana and its economic growth and development. Can you speak a little bit about the African Growth and Opportunities Act, or AGOA?
Well, AGOA, I think, is a trade agreement that may not necessarily have been to the advantage of the African economies. I think when we look at it, we have to assess who's really benefiting, who are the beneficiaries of the trade agreement. And I think it's being negotiated, and that we have to look at it as a continent, because it's really developed a growth consideration with respect to Africa. Botswana is much more independent thinking in terms of their economy because of their own ability to be able to transform their own economy. So I would think that less dependence would be with respect to some of the items in the Growth Act, but not necessarily to the advantage of a number of African economies.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay, so this next graph, we have two graphs here. The top graph basically shows the distinction between the various sectors of the economy. So we have the service sector, the manufacturing sector, and the agricultural sector, and also industry. And so if you look at the actual values of the economy, you see how the service sector in Botswana has really just basically taken off relative to the other sectors, you see. And so it's quite important, a major contribution to the economy. But when we normalize the graphs, and this is the second graph at the bottom, when we normalize the graphs to look at the growth and development, you see that there is a continuous trend line upwards until about, say, for example, about 2005. You see some of the growth rates specifically with respect to industry declining, but you still have positive growth rates. This is the scale on the left is a normalized graph, which allows us to be able to look at the growth of each of the economies at the same time. So what happens is that you still see an increase in manufacturing, you still see an increase in agriculture, and prior to the finding of diamonds, the cattle sector, agricultural sector with respect to cattle was the major contributor of foreign exchange earnings. And so now you can see that they continue to grow. The manufacturing sector is growing, and the industry sector, which includes the mineral sector, basically is fluctuating, and that fluctuates due to the international economy. One of the things about the diamonds in Botswana, they're the second largest producer of diamonds in the international economy, behind Russia. However, Botswana's diamonds are the highest quality diamonds, which then makes their value added substantial. And what has happened is that Botswana has been able to internalize a lot more of the value added of the production by incorporating the diamond sorting, which is now located in Botswana. So Botswana has been able to move very smart in terms of their strategies for economic development transition, because what they're doing is they're doing what a number of African countries are not able to do, is they're increasing the value added of the product in which they have as an export earner.
Okay, sticking with this slide, and very, very useful information, especially the second slide that you've just finished discussing, with services, or both of them just shows how the services sector has grown and grown tremendously. So my question is, can you expand on the opportunities for companies in the services sector in Botswana? What specific services are worth considering?
The financial sector. Botswana has a stock market, although it's small, but it's growing and it's becoming a significant contribution to the economy, but also the commercial banking sector. So in a region where the financial sectors may be limited, Botswana's financial sector is really very, very strong. Commercial banking and is very strong. And you have, say, for example, banks that are located there, international banks, for example. There are banks that are located in Botswana. And the other opportunities in terms of financial services is which I think is really critical. So I think that that's one aspect of the service sector. With respect to, say, for example, businesses interested in doing business in Botswana, I think they can look at the areas in which there's much competition between, say, Botswana and South Africa, and then basically develop services in those areas. Or I think it looks to be, for example, a possibility of African Americans trying to do business with Botswana. And I think that would be the trade in Botswana, exporting some of their goods and services, specific their traditional African antiques and things of that nature into the American economy, because I think they have some beautiful African items that Americans would really be interested in.
Okay, so that's a key point that you just mentioned in terms of the opportunities also for entrepreneurs in Botswana and the particular types of products that could enter the U.S. market, and then also doing business with African American entrepreneurs and business owners. So that's a very great point. Okay, so we'll move on.
What we have here is basically a chart that looks at Botswana's revealed comparative advantage by the top 10. And this was done by a paper that was published in 2007 by Macho Chikana, Macho Chikawawa. And he published this paper, which basically identified the top comparative advantage areas. And you see that the works of art and antiques is leading in terms of the growth rate of production. So that makes it really very important element. And then that's followed by vegetables, textiles, wood products, metal products, mineral products. So we have a scheme here that allows us to see where the competitive advantages are. And so people from outside or individuals from outside can look at this and examine this to see where there are possible areas of entry in terms of doing business in Botswana. So for example, for the import market. So we see that the works of art and antiques is a critical area that is important. So what is happening with the growth rate in GDP for the Botswana economy? Notice that in the long run, it's basically been a downward trend. Now, one of the things that has always been important is that Botswana was the leading growth rate country prior to China taking over in about 1991. And the economy was growing upwards of around 9%. But what has happened is that as the country matured, you find that the growth rate is declining. So you see that this again is another normalized graph. And so we're looking at the growth rate of gross domestic product and the globalization rate. And the globalization rate is basically the trade sector divided by the domestic sector. So if we look at it in terms of the trade sector, we're looking at the exports plus imports divided by GDP. So this is a rule of thumb examination of what's taking place, the globalization. So we see that there's a decline in globalization with respect to the economy, which indicates that what we're really observing is that the economy is producing more in the domestic economy to neutralize the exports plus imports factor, or the trade factor of the economy. And so usually what happens is that as the country matures, the globalization rate will decline. For example, Um, the United States globalization rate is about 0.3. So Botswana's rate is above that, but we see the downward trend that's really taking place. I think this is one of the main causes of the increased development and the success of Botswana. You know, you may have natural resources, but the institutions of government frame how those resources are used. And so what happens is we have, Botswana is in its fifth democratically elected president. And they've had successful presidencies who have focused directly on the economy. And so that has been a major critical factor in their success because they've had good government. And the thing about it is what makes it really very critical is most of the development has focused on the people of Botswana. And so therefore you can say, for example, I was working in Botswana in the early to mid 90s. And you found that at that time, they were just building the university. So now the University of Botswana is very, very well developed. They have a computer science department. They have a medical school. So they're basically building the institutions that they do not have to depend on, say, for going for South Africa. Because remember I said healthcare was one of the areas where Botswana people were going to South Africa. So now they have their own medical school and they're producing their own doctors to service their own economy. And so you have to say that the number one factor which has been critical to the growth and development of the economy is the success of the government agencies and the presidencies that they have selected who have contributed all of their resources to the development of their people. And see, that's the part that you don't hear about. You'll hear about the game parts. You know, if you go on the internet and type in Botswana, what you see are the game parks. And Botswana has some of the best, I think, best game parks in Africa. You see, so I think they compare with what's in Kenya, and I think in other places. And so I think, but you know, you'll see them on, say, Nature or some of those programs on television. For example, the Okavango Delta, which is very well known internationally as a jewel in itself to Africa. But you have a number of game parks in Africa that compete with the areas around. So I think must be some more information provided so people really understand that the economy matches the game parks in terms of the success and the ability to generate income. But I think the story of the growth and development rests primarily with the government and the institutional arrangements of the people in terms of how they have invested in their own economy. Anyone that is interested in doing business with Botswana, stop first at Business Botswana. Business Botswana is the manufacturing and commercial trade organization for the country. It's a private sector organization, and it has done very well in looking at developing the private sector. So if you're interested in doing business in Botswana, that would be your first stop. And that would provide you with an opportunity to understand the development background of the history of the growth and development of the private sector. But at the same time, you will have individuals there who would provide information on all of the different sectors with up-to-date information and the transformation of different areas. And so that would be the first place. But if I would suggest that if people were interested in doing business in Botswana, the first thing they should do is they should travel to Botswana and spend some time looking at the economy, looking at the organizations that are there to provide assistance in the business sector, and then have some idea of what's going on in the economy with respect to development, and then they'll be in a much better position to see the areas in which they can make a contribution. So I would say that you're basically on the same grounds of any developed economy with respect to looking at the risk. Now, Botswana has had some, as I indicated in the beginning, they're a country which is drought prone, so they have a number of droughts. They also had the HIV crisis, and this has to be one of the success stories in dealing with a major epidemic, because Botswana was able to marshal finances to basically provide assistance to the AIDS crisis during that entire period. And so now that's one of the critical parts that, you know, is not very well known, but in the academic literature, it's looked at a very impactful focus on the development of their economy during an epidemic. And now we're going through a pandemic, but they have the resources and the financial resources to be able to deal with that. And as I like to emphasize, Botswana basically uses its resources for its people. So they are more interested in making sure that the economy of the people are as well developed as with the economy of their resource base. And so that's one of the things that I think is really very critical. You have the institutions, and I think if you look at the institutions, the governmental institutions, the private sector institutions, the social institutions, I think you will have and come away with an area that lets you to understand that the risk is minimized because of the stability and the quality of those institutions. Their resources, they have vast mineral resources, and they know how to say, for example, address those resources in such a way, as I indicated earlier, to marshal those for their people. And they're basically the private sector and the government sector work together to essentially make sure that all of the planning that takes place is beneficial to the economy. And so if you're looking to do business in Botswana, I think it's a very safe environment. And I don't think you'll have any problem in terms of language or customs or things of that nature. It's an English-speaking country. And so you would not have any constraints that should limit you in investigating the economy of Botswana.